my first time trying a video like this. My name's Dan. I have a couple of YouTube channels, one of which is a electronic music channel, which I haven't been as active in just recording videos of me jamming, or I've been taking an approach where I'm recording more often without video, and not always just live jams, but also, a process where I might record things and then edit them together later in Ableton and not fuss so much about the live performance aspect and recording a video like that for YouTube. And I've made a conscious decision not to do the typical geartube videos, although I have to admit that, as you can see behind me, this is my modular synth setup, and by doing modular synth, it's indispensable to have videos to explain to me how modular synth works, because without that, I'd basically be left in the dark. And to give an example is that, like, when I first got into it, I had some friend of mine sold me an Axis Virus TI Snow, which I used a little bit, but I was under the impression that, it's basically, you could kind of do similar things with a plugin. Now you're able to get all the Axis Virus stuff as a emulation and run the exact same sounds just on your computer. And I was kind of predicting that would be available. So it would be nice maybe to have a full Axis Virus keyboard, perhaps, with the hands-on controls. But at that time, I was not really interested in the TI Snow desktop unit, and I traded it to somebody that I knew who was trying to get rid of or get out of the the modular synth game, to get rid of all his Eurorack stuff. And so he sold me, we did a trade where I got a bunch of Eurorack stuff for this Virus TI Snow, and at the beginning, I didn't have any idea how any of it worked. So I do, just first of all, it is really helpful having videos that are about specific individual modules and explaining how they work. But I have basically, on my channel, decided to take the approach that I am not going to do that. I'm just going to try to make music, basically. But if you notice, obviously, now I'm recording a video where I'm talking about it, and this is because I've noticed that there's a certain style of synthesizer videos now where people are just talking about the things that they're doing without going into showing off the sounds of the recordings, right? And now, I have to also admit that there is a certain trend in the community around synthesizers towards anti-intellectualism, I find, or there's a certain kind of intellectualism that I'm into that I'm just going to give as a warning. It may not be everybody's cup of tea. There might be certain people that find a certain style of intellectualism off-putting or pretentious, and but there's certain, like, for example, over the last few years, especially since COVID happened, I've been going through a period of time where maybe when I was younger, I used to get out to more shows. I used to like party more or something like that. And since COVID, I've just been kind of like reading a lot of books. Or that I had my interest in literature really expanded, and there's one of the obvious influences too is the getting into literature through exposure from the music scene, like people that who are musicians and artists, and there being a certain kind of like literary crowd in the music scene and an influence on stuff like modular synthesis, West Coast synthesis, that runs directly into what you might call post-structuralist philosophy, And this is basically looking, and modular synthesis and post-structuralist philosophy goes quite nicely together, because instead of being bound into the trappings of the like, if you think about just Western music as a structural system of how people think about composing, there's a way that you can just completely go beyond that with modular synthesis, and what you're doing doesn't resemble anything that would apply to music theory at all. And then, but then in out of modular synthesis, there's obviously you need to understand how the modules work, but it's a completely different ball game, right? It's like a completely, you can do something that is still music, and if you wanted to, you could produce the exact same, you could something that a band would play, a coherent piece of music. You could make that, reproduce that on a modular synthesizer. But there's what makes the modular synthesizer interesting is that it has the capacity to do a whole lot more other than that, right? And that is precisely why it's not as practical. And you can also, obviously, there's this thing about software. You can do the same thing in software. It is a bit, obviously, a little bit extravagant to have the physical hardware rather than just doing it all on software. But nonetheless, there's something about the tactile, or there's something about doing it in, or also it's not a dichotomy, because you can easily have integration between hardware and software. There's something more specific that I was wanting to get at with the idea of like applying philosophy to modular synthesis. It's specifically because one of the books these last few years I have read, Capitalism and Schizophrenia by Deleuze and Guattari, both the original Anti-Oedipus as well as 1,000 Plateaus. And there's a lot of stuff in 1,000 Plateaus where they're just directly talking about electronic music and experimental music composition, right? Now, I'm going to spare you actually pulling those books out and directly reading from them, but there's certain ideas too which are like the problem with one thing that's the problem with Deleuze and Guattari is that there's this idea of like intensive ideas versus extensive ideas, right? And that the idea then Deleuze and Guattari's concepts are extensive, and that they can be applied to a whole bunch of things. One of the criticisms that's leveled at these guys with their extensive ideas is that if you look at, for example, there's all sorts of bad things happening in the world, like the war, that the extensive ideas that these guys are dealing with deal directly with the war machine, basically, right? And deal directly with the process of that you can use an idea of deterritorialization and reterritorialization in multiple contexts. Being an extensive idea means that you could take one concept and apply it to a diverse range of things which may not really be related. And one of the things is obviously warfare, politics, the state, and with the background of everything that's happening in Israel and Palestine, you have the people want a two-state solution where it's not just one state wiping out the other state, but that's precisely what's been happening with a gradual deterritorialization and reterritorialization of Palestine. And this is actually, I saw a talk where Zizek used that example. Apparently, even that the Israelis were incorporating these ideas in their own kind of military field manuals, right? That there are but the thing is, what you have to understand is that from the perspective that Deleuze and Guattari are taking, a philosophical perspective, is that use this idea doesn't necessarily mean that you condone its use in applications of warfare, right? But it's an extensive idea that could be applied to warfare. It could also be applied to modular synthesizers, right? It could also be applied to music in general, right? So there's something, and just because that the idea is extensive and can be used in one context and used in another context does not necessarily mean what you're doing with a modular synthesizer is supportive of the Israeli genocide of Palestinians, right? Or that it's, I think even by setting it up like that, maybe we're getting off to a bad foot, right? But there's the idea that there's something, if you look at, for example, the panels in if you were in a bomber airplane, right? You'd have like a control board with a bunch of lights and switches, or like the panels of like a nuclear reactor, right? There's already a kind of a resonance with the acceleration of military technology and the acceleration of the kind of audio, deployment of new technologies in the field of art making, basically, right? And the culture industry, right? And so, there's a certain inherent value to the modular synthesizer, being that it, in terms of this idea of deterritorialization, right? Because if you look at what makes the modular synthesizer different from a normal synthesizer, like for example, I have my Base Station 2 here, which is a wonderful keyboard. This is a great value for your money. I got this this is a demo unit that I got from a local music store here in Canada, and you'd be paying twice as much for something from like a Moog or a Dave Smith. It's the Novation Base Station 2 is a great synthesizer. I would recommend it. But there's a limit to the Base Station 2 that there's a certain degree of flexibility in terms of routing the different modules one to another. But like, for example, like if you had a filter section and you'd created like a resonant peak, like a sharp resonant frequency, and then you're like, can I route that resonance into the actual oscillator to use the filter as a modulation source for the that's beyond what this thing's wired to do. The good thing about modular synthesizer is that there's no fucking rules. You can do that you can take anything and use it with anything. You can basically all the components of this synthesizer have been deterritorialized and open to basically infinite numbers of reconfigurations, right? But there's this idea that there's something inherently sinister and grotesque about doing that, because by having maintaining the integrity, the purity of the synthesizer in its natural form, you're respecting each component to be its own thing, to serve its own role and function in the hierarchy of how which is basically the same in all synthesizers, that you have an oscillator section, they go into a filter section, they're controlled by envelopes, and you might have some LFOs that you can patch creatively, and that's basically it, right? But the thing is, in a modular synthesizer, there's this total fluidity between an oscillator and an LFO. And then it's also kind of interesting is that you can even do a kind of a pseudo-filtering with an envelope generator, right? So it's something that's not even a filter, you can kind of use as a filter. And I'm not an expert in how the actual circuitry is wired, but there may be a way. There are certain people who are making really creative modules that are not quite a filter, not quite a oscillator, something in between, it starts to break down the boundaries of what one module is, what another module is, and from in a modular synthesizer context. It's just an open playing field for unlimited creativity. However, the same idea when applied to the field of warfare is a complete horror, because it means that you have your culture, you have your land set up as the way it is, and we can just fuck with it however we want, basically, right? What's the limit to how we can conquer your area, take it over, change everything, and make it ours, right? Or to basically take something that's built a certain way, through repeated shocks of trauma, break it down, and then rebuild, then repurpose it for something else, right? In the context of machines used for creative technology, it's an open playing field of complete creativity. In the context of war, it's absolute horror, basically, right? Or it's absolute uncertainty and terror, and like anything is up for grabs, and it's just like so. But it doesn't. There's a certain you know, the modular synthesizer also kinds of like, if I just sort of, I don't know if this will come across in the recording, but like. It sounds a little bit like the howling void in a way, right? Like a black hole in the midst of outer space, a kind of field of chaotic uncertainty, of raw potentiality that doesn't have a fixed. One of the things is that if you're just listening to this, you may be able to, somebody just might be able to ascertain that there's a kind of a synthesized, resonating, like maybe perhaps mutable instruments rings, right? The other thing about the idea of deterritorialization and reterritorialization is the problem about doing videos where, I mean, it is helpful in an educational way to take each separate module and just say, this is what this module does, this is all the different ways this module can sound, and that if you want to buy this module, this is what you can expect from this module. But it's another thing to record music with the modular and then present those sounds in a way where you're not just having the camera on the synthesizer the whole time, just reminding you that this is a synthesizer, this is the sound that it makes, this is, if you want to make this sound, you can buy this thing to do this thing. You know, there's another opportunity there, which is to like experience the raw sound on its own without getting into a conversation about the hardware. Right? And one of the interesting things about this is that this applies this idea of reterritorialization or deterritorialization in that it takes something that in the territory of people who are like music nerds or hardware geeks who are interested in how things work and the nuts and bolts, you can instead approach something where you can just like have some, you know, for somebody who doesn't know anything about synthesizers, what is this? It sounds like some pops and crackles. Some weird, it's almost a little bit like animal-like, a little like almost like a purring sound or a, see, it starts to, this is what, a squeak, right? It's like a little like a pucker or a little mouse squeaking. And there's something where it's like you can get into these. You can make a video about what I'm doing here and making it all about like brand associations, where this is what we have certain people manufacturing certain technologies under certain brand naming and you know, trademark associations, and if you want to make the sound, you can buy the. But it's like you can also just leave that out of the conversation and just like have the raw sound on its own as something that is deterritorialized from that whole context that you were just experiencing as a raw phenomenon. That is just a some audio thing that is because it's not, especially because it's not from a recognizable instrument like a guitar or something. You don't. The actual. I mean, if you know modular synths, it may not be that difficult to ascertain what this is, right? Not only the idea of taking sort of context and doing different things with them to do in that other in the original context, also this opportunity for opportunity to take the hardware out of the context, the sound of I think the problem with modular synth is that it's always into a context hardware who this module does that, what happens and there's no conversation sounds on their own out of that context, put them into some context where people just have to fucking around with trying to right, and you're just the deal with, right? Opportunity in that context for sounds to spark off a of people's you're trying to recognize it and attach it to a meaning or an association or a symbolic system of like and this is kind of interesting. Birds is that in that movie bird sounds was all synthesizers, right? People don't even watch that movie, not even think about synthesizers or the process of audio production. Instead, having to deal with the deterritorialized mixture of birds that don't actually sound like birds and synthesizers where the image, the association of the machine is separate from how you're experiencing it in the media, right? The media form which is disassociated from its production, and so you are left in your own association system. And then in that free association system, then it's sort of like, is there some kind of a meaning? In some of these, like, in AI, there's a random generation of images, some pattern emerges that forms a picture, right? If you just let things congeal on their own, picture, what does that picture say? Different from starting, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's just about me and my synthesizer. Like, I'm doing a little performance, and you can have, there's some promise deterritorialization of sound. Sound sparks off social networks, right? And that associative network, not just right, like that could do something more. Okay, well, I don't know, that's my idea, basically. We'll just see how... Thanks for watching.